Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. Hello and welcome to another episode of Galveston Unscripted. On this episode, I sit down with Dale Olson, one of the founders of the Laffite Society. Dale and other members of the Laffite Society have dedicated so much time and energy to studying the Laffite brothers on Galveston Island. That's right, Laffite brothers, not just Jean Laffite. Dale and I cover quite a bit in this discussion, not only piracy and privateering on Galveston Island, but the founding of the Laffite Society, some of the research that has been done and is currently being conducted, a few topics that are still being debated today. And Dale recognizes quite a few people have dedicated so much time and energy towards studying early Galveston history. I want to point out a few things in this episode. The love for history and seeking the truth, finding primary sources, and we all have our expertise. When Dale doesn't know something 100%, he truly doesn't speak on it. You'll hear during this episode that Dale points me towards many individuals who do know much more on the topic than he does. And by the time I'm recording this introduction, I have already made contact with most of the people that Dale has connected me with. Without further ado, let's hop right into my conversation with Dale Olson, co-founder of the Laffite Society. So Dale, I know we've been sitting here for about 10, 15 minutes. I feel like I've known you for my entire life. But could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from, and kind of how did you end up in Galveston?
Where I'm from is I was born in Houston, Texas, 1935, at St. Joseph's Hospital. My family, my mother was Elizabeth Olson. My father was Al Olson. I have one brother, Ken Olson. And the family moved here in 1939. And the reason we moved here is my father, Al Olson, was a very well-known radio announcer in the 1920s. And he always told me that he was very well known because he was possibly a little better than the other guy. But he was in radio, and as such, he was contacted by Sam Maceo about coming to Galveston and creating a large sound system, which consisted of large speakers strung all over the beach, the seawall. And they used that for what then they call splash days. And that was probably technically the opening of the beach. But he came here and constructed that for Sam Maceo. And he remained in the employ of Sam Maceo all during the Second War. He designed the sound systems and the lighting systems for all of the Maceo-held companies and nightclubs here in Galveston. As a hobby, he and my mother were involved in photography. Dad quit Sam Maceo 4 or 5 times, and only to be lured back with increases in salary and perks and this and that. But finally, in about 1945, right after the war, or 1946, he finally resigned from the Maceo employment. And he and my mother opened a studio on the Pleasure Pier. But that was created, I think that was built in 45 or 46. And at that time, there were 2 small structures on the entry, at the entry of the Pleasure Pier. The configuration now is different than what it was then. But on the structure that was on the west side was their studio. And they called it Elizabeth Olson Studios. And the reason is they actually started that while Dad was still working for Sam Maceo. And Sam Maceo didn't want him calling it Olson Studios because to Sam, that meant that Sam was not paying a high enough salary to one of his people, and he had to have a second job, which was a silly thing. But that was a reason it was called Elizabeth Olson Studios. And later on, it was just called Olson Studios. But there are still many pictures on the island now, primarily of brides. They were formal photographers. And at the bottom, it's embossed Elizabeth Olson Studios. So that's why we came to Galveston. And my brother and I both went through Sam Houston Elementary School, which is now a storage space for the Pleasure Pier. It's gone now.
Okay.
It's demolished. And we both went to Stephen F. Austin, what we call then junior high school. It's called by middle school, I guess, name. And we both went to Ball High School. I graduated in 1952, and my brother 2 years later. At Ball High School, that Diane Dolphy and I met and started dating. And that was when she was 14 and I was 16. So we have a relationship of 71 years coming up.
71 years.
I say that in 1961, we moved to Southern California in Orange County, In 1988, we returned to Galveston to buy a home, one of the Victorian homes in the East End. And by 1990, we couldn't resist a Strand. I wish we could have, but we couldn't. And we now own 3 large buildings on the Strand and a parking lot and other investment properties. I was a professional musician on the West Coast, and I was with Disney Studios for 20 years. I'm still deeply involved in research on technical elements of brass musical instruments. So that pretty much brings us up to today. And 1 week from today, tomorrow, I'm going back to Southern California.
Getting out of here as fast as you can. Huh?
Not as fast. No, not really. That's a negative connotation. It's not that. But we oscillate between. We own a home in Fullerton, Orange County, but we also have one out in the Coachella Valley, which in a town named Indian Wells near Palm Springs. So we spent some time there, sometime in Fullerton, California, and sometime in Galveston. So we're on the move.
That's great. That's great, Dale. Well, Dale, one reason I wanted to have you in today is because I know you are one of the co-founders of the Laffite Society.
Well, that's true. And quite often I'm recognized as the founder of the society, but I feel it terribly important to explain that there were 3 of us that were equally co-founders. And I will digress and give you just a few minutes background into how that started, because I think it's fascinating. At the time, we had bought one building on the Strand, on 21st and Strand, and there was a book dealer, Louise Nichols, in a nearby building. And Diane and I went there nearly daily to see if she had anything new. We were really actively building our library on Lafitte and Galveston history. So finally, Louise told us, she said, look, there's another gentleman in town who's very interested in the Lafitte era. Do you mind if I give him your phone number? And I said, no, that's fine. Within an hour, I got a telephone call from a friend of ours, Jean known us. And Jim today, we didn't know Jim at the time, but he today remains a very dear friend and a very esteemed authority on early Galveston history. So Jim immediately wanted to get with us, and he owned a store on the Strand called Pirate Alley. And he sold all sorts of books and historic artifacts, etc. So Jim and Diane and I got together, and I think within the first hour of just talking about Lafitte, we all decided it would be certainly nice to find others on the island that were likewise interested in early Galveston history and Lafitte. So we figured that possibly the best way to do that is we will start a society. Mm-hmm. We made that decision very early on in our acquaintance with Jim. And I will give credit to Jim for saying if we start an organization, it's got to be named the Laffite Society. So I said, Jim, I can't improve upon that. So it is now today named the Laffite Society. Jim and Diane and I and a couple of other very early people, Jeff Moduleski, Kathy Moduleski, Lou Graves Macbeth, Dorothy Karolanovic, and several who are no longer with us, we started meeting informally at our home then on Sealy. And we went into the formality of creating a society, a nonprofit society. And we elected officers. And I was chosen as president because there were no other volunteers at the time. But at that time, the interesting thing was that about his birthday, on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th of January, Diane and Jim and I would get in a car and drive to New Orleans, and we would plot out a field trip for the following April or May. And we did that many, many years going on. And as such, then we would create a field trip. On these field trips, we went to many places in Louisiana, some small little towns, and of course New Orleans. Multiple times we've been to Grande Terre, which is a little French-named island to the east of Grand Isle. We made a lot of friends down there, and that is, of course, where Lafitte was when he was in Louisiana on Grande Terre. We also, on 2 different occasions, went to the Yucatan and actually retraced the steps of where Pierre was taken when he was killed. We'll talk about that later, yes, possibly. And where Jean and Pierre probably were for a short period of time. We have attended the Louisiana Historic Society annual banquets, very formal banquets in Louisiana every year in New Orleans. And 2 times I was chosen as a keynote speaker at that event. So we traveled to New Orleans many times, traveled other places. We traveled to Yucatan, many places in Texas. And the Laffite Society was formulated, I guess, we started technically in 1994, and it still goes. And Jim Nonis is, again, the president, his second term.
We're going to do our best to get Jim on this podcast.
Yeah, he would be a delight.
Well, now that we have a little bit of background on the Laffite Society and yourself, maybe we could hop into the history of the Laffite brothers. I know that when people think of Galveston pirate history, they always think Jean Lafitte. But what a lot of people may not know is that there were two Laffites, right? So you had Pierre and Jean Lafitte.
At least.
Yeah, at least, right? At least.
You're right, yes.
So could we start from the beginning? Where did Jean Lafitte show up on the radar?
I didn't tell you to ask that question, but it's a tremendously interesting question. And I know the exact answer. I can tell you he first showed up on the radar, to use your term, and that is a coincidence, when he advertised in a New Orleans paper that he had lost his wallet. One of our members, a good friend of mine and a deeply revered Lafitte scholar, is Robert Vogel. And for many years, and possibly still, people often refer to him as the world's foremost authority on Jean Lafitte. And it is to Robert Vogel's credit that he wanted to know the same thing you just asked. When did he first show up on the radar? And it was an ad, a classified ad in the New Orleans newspaper. I lost my wallet. So it was he kind of snuck onto the scene.
Oh my goodness, that is great. Can we talk a little bit about Pierre? So yeah. Pierre, his brother, was he already in Louisiana when Jean was there?
Well, it appears to us that three people pretty much rose to awareness, I guess, public awareness in New Orleans about the same time. Jean Lafitte being one, the elder of the two brothers, and Pierre Lafitte being the other. But there is a third questionable brother, Dominique U, Y-O-U, sometimes Y-O-U-X. And Dominique was very involved with all of the activities of the Lafitte brothers. I don't think to this date that we can positively identify as Dominique as being a third brother, but it's a pretty good probability. He never was known as such. But they came in the early 1800s into New Orleans. They ostensibly had the Lafitte blacksmith shop, although we don't all agree that that was really their blacksmith shop, but the myth tells us that it was. And there's some documentation to that effect. And I will say that when some of us go to New Orleans to visit, one of the things we have to do is go have a drink at the blacksmith shop.
Absolutely.
And we always drink a toast to Jean and Pierre and Dominique and all the rest of that crew. The path that the Laffites took, it's pretty well accepted that Jean Lafitte was an extremely brilliant person. And Pierre was very smart. So the two of them collaborated and went down a pretty dark road at plundering and stealing things and reselling them. And the markup is very good if it doesn't cost you anything to obtain something, and you can sell it at your own price. So that's pretty much what happened. And they built the empire to the point where it was apparently extremely lucrative. And I'm giving you a little mountaintop view here. Mm-hmm. They became very well known in New Orleans and pretty highly respected. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew what they were doing, but they were highly respected citizens and very well liked. And the War of 1812, I think it already was over, but the people in New Orleans didn't know that, so they continued to fight the Battle of New Orleans. And Jean Lafitte purportedly, from many, many sources, many of which are reliable, greatly assisted in the Americans prevailing in that battle. The general story is that he provided the flints with which the rifles the Americans had could be fired. And of course, the Americans beat the English in that war. After the war, Jean Lafitte, from what we can tell, was probably a very, very affluent individual, was highly regarded, and could have probably lived the rest of his life in New Orleans as a highly respected, possibly retired bad guy turned good. And inexplicably, for various reasons that we've talked about for years, instead of enjoying that position, he came to Galveston and things went bad. So, and we can talk about that later. But that fills you in on them coming to New Orleans and subsequently to Galveston.
So after the War of 1812, Jean Lafitte assisted the U.S. government in defeating the British in various ways. And then he had his settlement at Barataria Bay, right? And that was around the same time?
Yes, that's correct. The settlement on Barataria Bay, and incidentally, we've been there on one of our field trips. In fact, we've been there twice.
What is it like out there in Barataria Bay?
Well, you go to several places. One is to go to the little town named Laffite, Louisiana, and we've been there several times. Delightful people down there, and I think in one of the areas down there are the three tombstones. Maybe Jean Lafitte, and he's not buried there. And there are two other people, historic figures.
Yeah.
The tombstones are there, but the bodies are not. Okay?
Gotcha.
And incidentally, we'll get to that later about what happened to Lafitte. But anyhow, the town of Lafitte is one place to go and see the area. And we've taken boat rides out into that area to see exactly what it was like, of course, given the changes over time. But the other place is Grand Isle, and the other one is a smaller island, Grande Terre. And on Grande Terre, there is a marvelous Fort Livingston. And that was built, I think, it was certainly built after Lafitte was there. It's a brick fort. And we have many photographs of it. And we've been there at least 2 times.
Okay.
And on Grande Terre, where that fort was, from all of our research, was exactly where, not where the fort is, but a little bit to the east of that fort, is exactly where the warehouses were that Lafitte had. And there's no evidence existing now. But between Robert Vogel, Jim Nonis, Dale Olson, Jeff Modulewski, and some of us had really involved ourselves in the study of that. And we know very close where his commune was on Grande Terre. It was during that time, there were fights, there were scuffles. The government, and I'm using that in a generic term because it was not only local sheriffs and people like that, but it was a federal government, and nobody wanted him down there.
Yes.
None of the bureaucrats wanted him down there. And he eventually left. And like I say, after the War of 1812, he could have, I think the whole fort and everything was gone by that time. And incidentally, returning, Fort Livingston, the brick fort, is just an incredible place. But the last time we were there, it is not too gradually just being gobbled up by the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. And to show you the level of scholarship among some of our people, on one of our first trip down there many years ago, maybe a dozen of us were sitting in a little bitty amphitheater there, looking around and wondering, I wonder what this was. I wonder what that was. And the conversation went on and speculation went on as to what was that little room over there. Robert Vogel, whom I've mentioned, said, well, just a minute. And Robert had a backpack. He pulled out copies of the original plans to Fort Livingston.
Oh, my
And he says,
goodness.
let's see what was there. They're federal records.
Oh, my gosh.
But Robert went to the trouble of getting copies of the original plans. So you encounter people like that in the Laffite Society. Jeff Modulewski, incidentally, translated for the first time The Pirates Lafitte by Rubio Magnier, who is a Mexican historian.
Oh, wow.
And that's set on the shelves in a lot of places, never translated. And Spanish is not that difficult.
Yeah, to translate to English.
A language to translate when you're in South Texas.
Yeah.
But Jeff did the full translation. Jeff, incidentally, has multiple master's degrees, one of them being in Spanish. In Spanish.
Well, let's transition over to Jean Lafitte and brothers, both, arrival in Galveston. So they arrive in Galveston. They choose Galveston because of its natural harbor, or was it was already operating as a port, I believe, right?
Well, to fill you in a little bit, within months of each other, not multiple years, Of course, they go back to the Spanish. There's this Galveston map of 1785, I think. So there were people here coming and going, and not many stayed. But after the Battle of New Orleans, as I say, I think one has to get into a little bit of a psycho assessment of why Jean Lafitte particularly would just start over instead of living the life of an affluent, well-known man in New Orleans. But he did come here, and Pierre followed him. And we have the names of all of the people who came here with him, or most of the names, let's say. Okay. Certainly we don't know all of them. There's another name we have to inject in this that is an extremely important, a monumentally important individual, Bartholomew Lafon, Lafon. Bartholomew Lafon, according to Vogel, was really more Jean Lafitte than Jean Lafitte was. Bartholomew Lafon was an immensely brilliant man. He was a cartographer who basically planned the French Quarter in New Orleans. He owned a wrought iron company. He was a land investor. He was an architect. And there are a lot of Lafon houses around in New Orleans. And he was a pirate. It was Bartholomew Lafon who came to Galveston, I will say first. Now, certainly Jean Lafitte had been here. It's just not that big a jump for people who lived on ships anyhow to go from New Orleans to Galveston. And Bartholomew Lafon, and this is documented, came to Galveston, I recall probably in the month of May of 1817. And he came on his boat, the Carmelita. The Carmelita was filled with building supplies. That might suggest to you that somebody had been to Galveston and said there's nothing there to build something with, and going back to New Orleans said maybe we better take a boatload of this stuff with us. And there again, the manifest for that is a federal record, and it exists. So we know when Lafon came and what he brought with him. To digress again, or let's say to approach this from a different angle. Yeah. Okay. There was a man named Kennedy, Roger Kennedy, and I'm going back 20 years now, who was very prominent in the Smithsonian, very, very prominent historian. And he has written several books. And in one of his books, he says that Bartholomew Lafon came to Galveston with a boatload of building materials and built the Maison Rouge, the Red House of Jean Lafitte. There is no support for that. And I was in communication with Dr. Kennedy before his death, and I asked him if he could give me the primary source of that. And Dr. Kennedy referred to an earlier writing of his where he'd said the same thing, and that's
not quite really, the primary source.
That does not really solidify it. But if you forget the legalities and the technicalities and the documentary evidence, and if you go from just, I would say, common sense, here we have a man who was an architect with a boat full of things to build things with, and with a friend, Jean Lafitte, who wanted to come here, who needed a place to stay. One might say then it made a lot of sense, and I'm one of those that believes that Bartholomew Lafon did come here on the Carmelita. He did have the lumber and all of those things to build with, and that he did build Maison Rouge. Now, if Jean Lafitte were sitting here today, he would not know what we're talking about because it was not called Maison Rouge when he was here. To our understanding, probably it started being known that in the mid to late 1800s. And there was an English writer, Bollert, Boellart, I think is a spelling. I don't remember the first name. And it appears that was the first reference to a red house. And I left off a tremendously important name in my list earlier of real foremost Lafitte authorities, Jean Epperson. Jean Epperson could put most of us in the dust. She's deceased now, a dear, dear friend of ours. But it was Jean who researched when was the term Maison Rouge first used, and that was her finding.
Oh, wow. So when was that term?
That was in the mid to late 1800s that Bollert wrote that. He was an Englishman who came here. Where he got it, we are uncertain. And Jean apparently could not find an earlier reference to Maison Rouge. Mm-hmm. They called it Laffite's house. They called it Laffite's fort. But they didn't call it Maison Rouge. Mm-hmm. We still do.
Yeah. So his original home, would it have been a mixture between wood and brick and stone, or?
It would probably have been wood and brick. There are many people, contemporary writers even, that go by 1417 Harborside and look at that and claim that that's Jean Lafitte. Well, that property was built in 1885. And I think you mentioned earlier some interest in early Galveston fires. Mm-hmm. And there was a terrible fire in 1885. But that building was spared. It was being built about that time.
There are beautiful photos of that building, actually. And it's a gorgeous Victorian home.
Oh, yeah.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah. It was an exceptional home. And Diane, my wife, she and I went to the Laffite archives in the Historic New Orleans collection in New Orleans years ago. And we went through the whole thing to see if we could find any reference to a house in Galveston. We could not at that time. But we did find, Diane pointed out many architectural similarities between other properties that Laffite had built and the Maison Rouge.
Do we have drawings of the Maison Rouge, of his original?
The original?
Do we have drawings of that?
No.
Okay.
And it's a terribly upsetting reason that we don't. There was a Galveston physician, J.O. Dyer, D-Y-E-R, and he came to Galveston, I think, in the late 1880s. And the Galveston Daily News at that time published an immense amount of stuff written by Dyer. He was a prodigious writer and, unfortunately, a terrible historian, because he didn't document anything.
Oh, no.
And he did not give us references. And some people, Gene Epperson having been one, just dismisses it all as it can be made up. Mm-hmm. But I don't take that strong a position, because I see J.O. Dyer as being a fascinating man who was a medical doctor and wrote. So there's nothing wrong with that, you see. Yeah. From a historian's perspective, there were severe flaws, you see. But if a medical doctor would look at that, he'd think that's pretty cool. Here is a medical doctor who's taken the time to write about history. So J.O. Dyer lived in a rooming house with other men, and 3 of them had been here with Lafitte. Now, that was in 1880, so that was about 60 years after Lafitte. That was 1870, I'm sorry, so it would have been 50 years after Lafitte left. And these guys, whether they really stayed or came back later, is maybe a little bit unclear. J.O. Dyer talked to all 3 of those in depth, and he reported on it in his voluminous articles in the Galveston Daily News.
Oh,
and anyone interested in early Galveston history, and to quantify that, I'm saying the early 19th century, not the 20th century. Anybody who's interested in that should really go read the Dyer articles at the Rosenberg Library. But J.O. Dyer was single his entire life. And I have copies of his will and everything else. I studied Dyer intensively. And at one point, he listed his collection that he was giving to Rosenberg Library. Mm-hmm. And it is terribly sad to think that he had given a firsthand drawing from the memory of a man who was here of Maison Rouge to the Rosenberg Library. It's no longer there. Where it went, we don't know,
Nobody
but
knows.
I do know it hasn't been there since the 1980s.
Wow.
So it went somewhere. J.O. Dyer, in some of his articles, demonstrates his very, very advanced ability at freehand drawing. He has pictures of some primates, some birds and things in some of those articles, and it's expertly done. So my theory, Robert Vogel, and I think Jim Nonis and Modulewski, all of them agree with me that probably J.O. Dyer, living with these guys, sketched the house because he was excellent at that. And they said they corrected him until they got it accurate. And unfortunately, John, that's gone.
I wonder if it's just mislabeled somewhere and hiding in there. It'll be found one day.
Things do pop up.
Yeah.
They do pop up.
Mm-hmm. I hope that pops up. I really do. I mean, because it would be a really significant find for Galveston history.
It would be tremendously significant. Yes, that would have been nominally the first structure on Galveston Island. And I will say that, we have a historic society here, foundation actually. We have a historic foundation here. We have some people in city government who claim to be interested, especially when they're running for office, in Galveston history. And we have a lot of armchair historians here in Galveston. And I would imagine right now you could handpick 100 of them and ask them where is the oldest architectural element on Galveston Island. And the answer to that is on that property. There is a well on the back of that property on the east side of the foundation on that property now. Don Marler, a dear friend of ours, Sheldon Kendall, a member of our society who might be listed in that saying, I'm adding people to that list.
Yeah,
now.
Keep on adding. It's okay.
But Sheldon Kendall is an archaeologist, and he descended into that well on about 3 different occasions.
Oh my God, how deep
and
is
the
it?
most recent, but I think A&M or somebody provided big pumps to pump out the groundwater as he went down. And I thought he got down to 10 or 11 feet.
Okay.
And started finding some burned timber down there.
Oh.
Until it became unworkable.
Yeah.
So Sheldon, again, wanted to do that. And age has crept up on Sheldon and me and most of us. And I don't know that will ever be done, but that is probably...
Maybe I'll do it.
Well...
No, I'll go climb down the well.
We'll find a pump.
I'll call A&M. Give me the pumps. Let's go.
We can try to find the pump in a wetsuit for you. Yeah. But anyhow, that is something that not many people understand. Mm-hmm. And everybody's going on their own path. But the research is there, and it goes back to one of the early Spanish maps where it says Pozo, P-O-Z-O. And Jeff Modulewski and I have talked about it in depth, and that could, in Spanish, could be hole or depression or whatever, but it could also be well. Mm. And we think, and that was on a very early map.
Okay.
Before Lafitte.
Yeah.
And there is documentary evidence in writing about there being a well on that site because it refers to the brackish water that came out of the well. Yeah. And that well is still there. It's oval in shape. And the research that we've done, most of the scholars refer to it as the oval feature rather than a well or a pozo or anything. From the time we moved to Southern California, the time we moved back here, all those years, every time we came back to visit, we would drive by that site. An architect in Houston named Douglas Zwiener owned it at that time for many years. It became available for sale when Zwiener died. And Diane bought that for me as a Father's Day present in the early 1990s. And I will respond to the next unanswered or unasked question. We have no firm plans for it at this point. Douglas Zwiener wanted to turn it into a restaurant, and other people have wanted to do other things. The man that owned it in the 50s, it was basically torn down in the 50s. And to my understanding, there were several fires there. And at one point, he demolished the wooden structure. In other words, everything above that raised concrete foundation. Yeah. And the wood purportedly was used to repair other properties that Mr. Jacobson owned on the island, what we call the Hendricks Castle, built in 1885. So it would have been parts of that. I do think this. I think Diane pretty much established that the footprint of that building is the same as the footprint of the original Maison Rouge, as ascertained by the archaeologists who have done the research on it. So there are those that think that the footings that is the ground level or maybe a little below ground level footings, were the original Maison Rouge. There's no reason it wouldn't have been.
So Jean Lafitte was in Galveston from 1817?
Yes.
1817 to
1820.
1820. Oh, so really only 3 years.
And see, that's one of the documented issues that is widely misstated. He came in 1817 and left in 1820. You will find probably 1821 is the most widely printed date, but it was 1820.
All right, so Jean and Pierre show up in Galveston. They immediately pretty much start exactly what they were doing in Barataria Bay, correct? They start, was it privateering operations from Galveston, or was it more pirateering?
Well, the distinction, to my awareness, of privateering is basically a legal pirate. In other words, somebody, a bureaucrat in some country somewhere has said, okay, we'll give you a license on our behalf, because theoretically, if you're a small country and you don't have a navy to go after the Spanish at that time, well, then somebody's going to do it for you. Well, you'll give them part of the proceeds. It really didn't work that way. One of our past presidents, Larry Porter, has written and studied the issue of letters of marque, meaning I give you permission to do whatever you want to do over there. Yeah. It was usually from Cartagena or Colombia that they would get these letters of marque. And technically what they were supposed to do is to give some of the proceeds. They would go against a Spanish ship and capture it. They bring the ship back here. They're supposed to give part of that to the people in Cartagena and keep part of it. Well, most of it probably stayed here. Shipping costs.
Yeah. They would get their letters of marque from Cartagena, and the base of operations was Galveston. So I understand they had the pirates here in Galveston had a few run-ins with the natives here. So the Karankawa. One famous battle is the Battle of the Three Trees.
I know a little about it. I know there weren't three trees.
Yeah. Well, could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between the natives that were here at the time and the pirate colony?
That is an area I know the least amount, very frankly. There are people who are authorities on the Karankawas, and they know an awful lot more about that issue than I do. But as far as the interaction between the Laffite settlement, let's say, and the indigenous people at that time, from what I gather, it was pretty much a standoff thing, because both could benefit from each other in various ways. But also they were antagonists, because the Karankawas at that time had the full run of the island. Mm-hmm. And here Javier Mina came in, and Henri came in, and then Lafitte came in. So here you get these three different camps coming in here with a lot of people and ships, and things changed. So I would imagine that upset the people who were already living here, or at least it modified their lifestyle. So there are documented occurrences of altercations between the indigenous people and the newcomers, so to speak. The legend of the three trees has to do with the far west end of the island. There were not three isolated trees, but where that myth came from is that apparently coming in from the Gulf and looking west, it appeared to be three trees. There were two trees, pretty widespread apart, and a grove of trees. And the grove of trees was often just referred to as a tree, so it was three trees. The potential of a Lafitte treasure being there is just borders on being silly. But that pretty much is my understanding. It was a standoff between the indigenous people who were here and the pirates. And eventually, of course, I'll call them privateers, they left. In a couple of years, they were gone. So the interesting era of history in Galveston, and the least explored, is the era between 1820 and about 1835, 1836, 1837. But in 1838 is when the city of Galveston was formed, so you've got an 18-year span when many interesting, fascinating things were going on here, but not by many people. It just was not heavily populated.
Okay, there's one thing I have to bring up, and that is Jean Laffite's treasure. Did he leave a treasure behind on Galveston Island?
Okay, I once gave an hour lecture on the treasure of Jean Laffite, and I'll assure you right now I won't go into that.
Okay.
I will talk about treasure in a very truncated manner. You first have to figure out what is a treasure. What are we talking about? Well, if you go in one of our buildings on the Strand, we have a pirate shop, okay? And in the layman, if you talk about a pirate's treasure, they envision the stereotypical big chest with gold and silver and necklaces and all kind of jewelry and everything hanging out of it, and the pirate standing there with his foot on it with a sword. Well, if that's the treasure we're looking for, we can stop right now because it didn't happen. A treasure can be that. If you walk out of here today and find a diamond on the sidewalk that's worth $100,000, that's a treasure. To an archaeologist, a little piece of pottery, a little shard of pottery, an 1/8 of an inch, sometime can be a treasure. They found something that is meaningful to them, not to other people. To historians, to use your perfect example, locating that drawing by Dyer of the original Maison Rouge would be a treasure beyond word for us, for the people who are interested. The guys that want to come down on their Harleys with a bunch of beer and go to the beach, they don't care.
Yeah, they don't care.
We do.
Yeah.
So the treasure is in the eyes of the beholder. The guy with the beer on the Harley, if he sees a custom-made Harley, well, that's a treasure to him. So we have to decide what that is. And then we have to look at this. From a rational view, Galveston was basically a barren island. That's the reason Bartholomew Lafon brought the building materials. There was nothing here to make anything from. It was a bunch of marsh and swamp and water and weeds.
And sand.
And some beach, yeah. Beach would have brought some of the Houstonian adventurers there.
Yeah.
So there were no, other than the 3 trees, so to speak, and Lafitte knew there weren't 3 trees. There was a big grove out there. But for him to have buried anything or left anything that was unretrievable, because we do and have long had a seawall that kind of stops the water, not a whole lot, but a little bit. At that time, there was no seawall. There was nothing. The water went right over Galveston. There was a terrible storm in 1818, the year after Lafitte got here. And fortunately, there are contemporaneous reports about that storm. And that came from a group 100 miles from here, I guess, in Liberty County. At that time, they were trying to start a French settlement called Champ d'Exil, Camp of Exiles. Well, those people had left their settlement, which wasn't doing too well, and come to Galveston when that storm hit. Hartman and Millard, I think, are the 2 authors of the book. They give a contemporaneous recitation of what was going on in Galveston in 1818 during that storm, and everything was inundated. So Jean Lafitte would not have buried treasure on an island where he couldn't find the landmark next time. You don't put a stick in the ground and hope it's going to be there. The other issue is that Lafitte basically was broke when he left here. He didn't have the money. And we know that he took wood with him from some of the little buildings here. So if you have a big ship and you're carrying wood and you don't carry diamonds and gold and silver that'll fit in your pocket, it makes no sense. Mm-hmm. So basically, he didn't have much. And we have to view what the treasure is. I think from the stereotypical view, it just doesn't exist. And the building that's going on in Galveston, the excavation and this and that, and we have to look at, they were basically here on the east end of the island. And at this time, John and I are sitting here at the 21st and Market, for those of you who know the island. The places around here, even roads, even streets, there is some excavation. There was an old pistol excavated by some building out at UTMB some years ago. And at that time I studied about it. It was a very old pistol. I don't know if it dated back to the Lafitte era. So there is a potential for still finding something. We own several buildings on the Strand, and behind one of them, it's never been excavated. In other words, a building, it's a U shape, and there's a patio there. Now, we have brick pavers in there. But at one time, the Houston Archaeological Society with Sheldon Kendall came down to do a dig in there. And it was in June, and it became so hot they gave it up.
Oh, my gosh.
So there is the potential of some isolated little piece of land here or there being excavated, and to find something that to an archaeologist or a historian might be very important. But for those looking for the treasure chest, it just probably doesn't exist.
One thing that I definitely want to touch on is the slave trade. So Jean Lafitte, I know one thing, whenever the United States made it quote unquote illegal to import slaves into the U.S., but there was still a loophole through the customs house in Louisiana.
Yes.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
I will give you a little bit of background.
Yeah, please.
Because here again, it's interesting that very few, if any, academicians study Lafitte. And I'll give you an example. Several years ago, the Laffite Society, in conjunction with Texas A&M, sponsored a one-day seminar at A&M here in Galveston on Lafitte. 6 or 8 lecturers. A whole day thing went on. And it was by the foremost authorities on Lafitte, many of whom were in our group. I deeply wish I could remember the gentleman's name. He's a professor of history at University of North Texas, my alma mater. And I searched around back then for a keynote speaker from academia. I found no one in Texas and no one in Louisiana who claimed authority on Laffites. Nobody in any university or college, and in the 2 most important areas related to Laffites, not any of the professors wanted to even tackle it. It's an extremely complex issue to study. But we did find a man who was a professor at University of North Texas, and we brought him down because he told us at the time, he says, I probably don't know as much about the Laffites as you guys. And Rosenberg Library, if you go talk to them and want to know, they say you better go talk to the Laffite Society. But the reason I bring this up is that this professor was an authority on the slave trade. So he is the top man that would be able to really get into the answering of a question such as that, because he comes at it from interdisciplinary perspective, from the historic and from the legal and all of the social, all of the different elements that converge to this nexus of being a slave trader. Yes, it happened, but and certainly without naming, but at least a few known to me of the real prominent old Galveston families now were slave traders and owned slaves. And that is a subject that some people don't want to talk about. It's history, and it happened. And there are a lot of us that hope that is now being rectified. You can't change it. It did happen. But now the social injustice and I will say selectivity in many of the social elements of our society nationally now have to wrestle with those issues. And that's about the best I can sidestep an issue that I don't really have an authority on. Absolutely.
I'll try if I can get in contact with that professor from the University of North Texas.
Yes, I would very much like to, and I have his, I'll remember it as I'm driving home.
Yeah, perfect.
Of course. He is an excellent speaker, a tremendously knowledgeable man, and it just, he was a tremendous hit down here when he came and gave that talk. In fact, I think we had him back a second time at some point. He's that impressive.
I'm gonna contact him.
I will give you an introductory note to him because you would fit with him very, very, very well.
Perfect. Can we talk about Jean Lafitte and his basically exile from Galveston Island?
the story is that he was ordered off of Galveston by the federal government. And that's pretty accurate. He was. I don't know what would have happened had he not left, except they would have sent another ship down with another bureaucrat or another. It was usually the military that would come in and tell him he's got to leave. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to bombard the island if he doesn't leave by Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. But it was certainly a sign to Lafitte that the days are over. You're not going to be able to do this anymore. Parenthetically, I'll mention that we think he was French. Jack Davis pretty much confirmed that he's French. The other end of the story, we used to say we don't know exactly where he came from or where he went, and we don't know much between. That was kind of a cliche that we used. Well, we know he was probably from France. And like I say, Jack Davis confirmed that. How did he end up? There are other stories. Purportedly, he did this and did that and this and that with no corroboration or very thin corroboration or contrary corroboration, which is not corroboration. The best information that I have, or that most of the esteemed scholars have, was uncovered by Jean in a Columbia newspaper in, I guess, 1821, maybe 22. And it was just a small little article that says that the pirate Jean Lafitte was killed in a shipwreck off of the coast of Honduras. That is the most plausible. All of these stories about him living a long life and doing this and doing that afterwards, in a future discussion, maybe.
Yes, I would love to have you on again.
Is to talk about the library in Liberty County that was built by Price Daniel. He built a library basically for all of this stuff that was purportedly from Jean Lafitte. And it wasn't. It was a hoax. And the library is still there. So exactly what they're doing about it, I'm not sure right now.
Yeah.
So that is another subject.
I gotcha.
But the bottom line that we think is we know he went from Galveston, he ended up in Cuba, possibly in jail in Cuba. And then he ended up probably killed in a ship battle off the coast of Honduras. Pierre Lafitte, we know for sure, was killed at Isla Mujeres, which is off the coast of Cancun. And he was severely damaged there, or injured, I guess is the best word. And he went with two other people, a woman, Lucy Allen, and he went with a Canadian privateer. Those three took a boat and ended up on the coast of Mexico. And a lot of the people down there still think they are descended from the pirate Lafitte. Contrary to calling him Jean Lafitte, they call him the pirate Lafitte. And Lucy Allen reportedly was pregnant at the time. By the time they landed, Pierre had died. They took, apparently, the Canadian pirate and interrogated him about what was going on.
Yeah.
All of that was federal records, Mexican records. And Rubio Magnier put it in his book, The Pirates Lafitte, which Jeff Modulewski translated. So we have contemporaneous information, documentation, that it was Pierre who died on the coast of the Yucatan, not Jean.
That's going to be next on my read list. I love it. Well, Dale, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. This has been overwhelmingly informative. It's amazing. Is there anything that we did not discuss at all that you would want to say about the Lafitte brothers?
Well, I guess not succinctly. There's a cliche that we use a lot. In the absence of data, myth survives. And that's what's happened. There are so many phony stories and myths about Lafitte, and therefore they have to rely upon recent sources perpetuating myths or perpetuating misinformation. And I would suggest that anybody that's really interested in I'm saying Laffites, but I'm also talking about early Galveston history, the period of Sackarap, which was a little town here, is fascinating. And Lou Macbeth, our friend that I mentioned to you,
Yes.
Lou Graves Macbeth, whose family's been here since, I think, 1842. Lou is immensely knowledgeable about the era after Lafitte left and when the city was formed. She has lectured on the crew left behind. In other words, she knows all about the people that might have stayed here or left and came back a little bit later. So that era is very important.
Dale, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. I really hope we can sit down again one of these days.
Certainly we'll get together again.
Great. Thank you so much, Dale.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this conversation with Dale Olson. If you enjoyed this podcast, please reach out on social media and let us know what you think. And please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it, whether it's Google Podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever. The podcast is literally available everywhere. And Dale dropped a lot of names on this podcast. I'm going to do my best to get every single one of them in here to record an oral history and get them to tell me everything they know about early Galveston history. Thank you for listening and supporting. We will see you next time on Galveston Unscripted. For historic resources or more information, check out the episode description.